Welcome, dear listener, to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, and together we'll search for truth where others see only tea and roses. But beware, behind the lace curtains lurks betrayal, and behind every clue a killer waits, in the tranquil village of St. Mary Mead, where blooming meadows mask simmering secrets. A cherished baker collapses, poisoned by a deadly apple turnover. Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, untangling a sinister web of jealousy among 5 suspects. A grieving widow hiding debts, an impatient apprentice craving power, a vengeful rival baker, a scorned chemist with access to poison, and a cantankerous pensioner nursing old grudges. Hidden in bitter crumbs, a misplaced silver spoon and a cryptic letter lies the truth. But can Marple expose the killer before death strikes again? Plunge into this gripping Agatha Christie-style mystery, where every clue is a twist and danger lurks in the coziest corners. Chapter 1. The Scent of Death, nestled in the undulating embrace of rolling meadows, where golden wheat fields met the soft haze of distant hills, lay the village of St. Mary Mead. It was the autumn of 1953, a season when the air carried the crisp tang of fallen leaves and the faint earthy promise of harvest. The echoes of the war had softened into distant memories, replaced by the gentle cadence of rural existence. The lowing of cows in the pastures, the clip-clop of horse-drawn carts along winding lanes, and the cheerful chime of the church bells, marking the hours with unhurried grace. Wildflowers dotted the verges, poppies nodding like sleepy sentinels, buttercups gleaming like scattered coins, and sheep grazed contentedly under the watchful eye of ancient oak trees that whispered secrets to the wind. At the heart of this pastoral idyll stood the village bakery, a humble yet inviting establishment with a weathered sign swinging gently in the breeze, Pettifer's Pastries. Its mullioned windows framed an array of temptations, crusty loaves still warm from the oven, buttery scones dusted with sugar, and fruit tarts glistening with jewel-like preserves. The aroma that wafted from its chimney was the very soul of St. Mary Mead, drawing villagers like a siren's call, to gather, gossip, and savour the simple pleasures of life. Mr. Harold Pettifer himself was as much a part of the village as the meadows that surrounded it. A robust man in his late 50s, with a beard perpetually flecked with flour like fresh snow on a hedgerow, and eyes that crinkled with good humour, he ruled his domain with a rolling laugh and a generous hand. "A sample for the wee ones," he'd say, slipping a biscuit to a child, or "try this new recipe on the house" to a regular. His bakery was more than a shop. It was the warm hearth where neighbours exchanged news over a cup of tea, where romances blossomed amid the scent of cinnamon, and where the daily bread bound the community in quiet contentment. But on this particular morning, as the sun climbed lazily over the eastern meadows, casting long shadows across the dukist grass, an unnatural hush enveloped the bakery. Young Billy Jenkins, the delivery boy, a freckled lad of 14 with boundless energy and a bicycle that rattled like a tin can, pedalled up the lane as usual, whistling a tune from the wireless. He propped his bike against the wall and pushed open the door, expecting the familiar blast of warmth and the boom of Mr. Pettifer's greeting. Instead, silence greeted him, a thick, oppressive quiet broken only by the faint tick of the wall clock. The ovens, usually roaring with life, stood cold and dark. A strange, acrid undercurrent tainted the air, cutting through the lingering sweetness of yesterday's bakes, like a discordant note in a symphony. Billy's whistle faltered as he ventured further, his boots scuffing on the flour-dusted floorboards. "Mr. Pettifer, sir," he called, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty space. In the back room, where sacks of flour leaned like sleepy giants against the walls, and rolling pins lay scattered on the workbench like forgotten tools of creation, Billy found him. Mr. Pettifer lay sprawled on the flagstones, his robust frame unnaturally still, his face twisted in a grimace of surprise and pain, as if caught mid-laugh by an invisible hand. In his rigid fingers, he clutched a half-eaten apple turnover, its flaky pastry crumbling onto his apron, the filling oozing like a dark omen. Billy's stomach churned. He backed away, his cries piercing the morning calm as he bolted for the constable's house. Word of the discovery spread swiftly, like wildfire through dry grass. Constable Slack, a young officer with a stern moustache and a notebook perpetually at hand, arrived with Dr. Haydock, the village physician, a kindly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a reassuring bedside manner honed by years of tending to St. Mary Mead's ailments. The doctor knelt beside the body, his examination thorough but gentle, as if respecting the baker's dignity even in death. "Arsenic," Dr. Haydock pronounced quietly, straightening with a sigh. "Ingested, I'd wager, sometime last evening. The symptoms are classic. The bitterness he might have mistaken for a bad batch of spice. A dreadful way to go, but mercifully quick in the end." Constable Slack scratched his head, his face pale. Accident? Or foul play? Who'd want to harm old Pettifer? He was the life of the village. The news rippled outward, carried on the wings of gossip from cottage to cottage across the meadows where farmhands paused in their labours to shake their heads in disbelief. By midday, the high street buzzed with hushed conversations. Poisoned in his own bakery. Unthinkable! Always so cheerful, handing out treats. Who could have done such a thing? In her neat cottage on the edge of the village, where roses climbed the walls in profusion and the garden hummed with bees, Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, a pot of tea steaming beside her. The elderly spinster, with her fluffy white hair caught in a sensible bun, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing behind her spectacles, and her lap occupied by a half-finished knitted shawl, appeared the very picture of serene retirement. But those who knew her, and many in St. Mary Mead did, understood that her mind was a finely tuned instrument, attuned to the subtleties of human behaviour as a violinist to strings. It was her neighbour, Mrs. Price Ridley, who brought the tidings over the garden fence, her voice quivering with a mix of horror and excitement. "Miss Marple, have you heard? Poor Mr. Pettifer, dead as a doornail in his bakery. Poison, they say. Arsenic in his turnover." The doctor confirmed it. What is the world coming to? Miss Marple set down her teacup, her expression one of mild surprise, though her thoughts raced ahead like a fox through the meadows. "Dear me," she murmured, her needles resuming their rhythmic click-clack. "Poison in a place of such warmth and nourishment. How very like life, sweet on the surface, but with hidden bitters. I must pay my respects to Mrs. Pettifer. Human nature, my dear Mrs. Price Ridley, is ever the same, whether in a grand city or our quiet meadows. And poison, well, it's such a personal choice, isn't it?" As the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow over the rolling fields, the village of St. Mary Mead held its breath. The bakery door remained shut, its windows dark, but the scent of death lingered. A subtle undercurrent that promised more than met the eye. Little did the villagers know, the unassuming Miss Marple had already begun to sift through the flour of facts, seeking the grains of truth that would reveal a killer hidden in plain sight. Chapter 2. Dough and Doubts. The afternoon sun slanted through the canopy of oaks lining the high street of St. Mary Mead, casting dappled patterns on the cobblestones that danced like elusive clues in a half-solved puzzle. The village, still abuzz with the morning's grim discovery, carried on with a subdued energy. Housewives lingering longer at the grocer's to exchange whispers, farmhands pausing in the meadows to shake their heads over pitchforks. Miss Jane Marple, her straw basket swinging gently from her arm, made her way toward the bakery, her steps measured and purposeful. The basket contained jars of her homemade blackberry preserves, a thoughtful gesture for the bereaved, but also a key to unlock doors and tongues in times of tragedy. She had donned her best afternoon dress, a soft grey wool that blended seamlessly with the village's muted tones, her spectacles perched on her nose like vigilant sentinels. The bakery's door was closed, its cheerful sign now seeming almost mocking in the light of loss. But Miss Marple knocked softly on the side entrance leading to the living quarters. It was opened by Mrs. Edith Pettifer, the baker's widow, a woman of sturdy build and practical demeanour, her apron still dusted with flour, as if habit refused to acknowledge the void. Her eyes, swollen from tears, brightened slightly at the sight of the visitor. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," she said, her voice thick with emotion, ushering her into the warm kitchen where the scent of yesterday's bakes lingered like a ghost. The room was a haven of domesticity. A vast scrubbed oak table dominated the centre, surrounded by shelves groaning under tins of spices, jars of preserves, and rolling pins worn smooth by years of use. Copper pans gleamed on hooks, and a kettle hummed on the range, offering a semblance of normalcy amid the sorrow. Mrs. Pettifer busied herself pouring tea from a chipped pot, her hands trembling slightly as she added milk. "Harold loved his tea strong," she murmured, "just like his opinions." "Sit, please. The constable's been and gone, but the questions, they swirl like dough in a mixer." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her keen eyes taking in every detail. The faint white powder on the floorboards, flour, or something more, and a ledger peeking from a drawer, its pages marked with hasty notes. "A dreadful shock for the village," she said gently, accepting her cup. "Harold was the very heartbeat of St. Mary Mead." "Tell me, my dear, how did the evening unfold? Was he alone when—" Edith sank into the opposite chair, her broad shoulders slumping. "He stayed late, as always, preparing for the morning rush. I retired early, headache, you know. When I came down at dawn, he was gone." Her voice broke, but she composed herself, revealing a resilience born of rural life. As they sipped, the conversation turned to those closest to the baker, each name dropping like a crumb, leading deeper into the mystery. First among them was young Tom Wilkins, the apprentice, who entered from the backyard just then, wiping his hands on a rag. A lanky youth with tousled hair and a face that could shift from boyish charm to sullen shadow in an instant. Tom had come to St. Mary Mead from a nearby orphanage, taken under Pettifer's wing 3 years prior. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but guarded, his eyes flicking to the ledger as if it held secrets. Terrible about the master. He was teaching me the trade, said I'd run the place one day. Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. A fine ambition, Tom. You must have been close. Did you help with the baking last night? Her question was light, but her gaze noted the slight twitch in his jaw. I mixed the dough for the turnovers, he replied, shifting his weight. Left around 8, had errands. Mr. Pettifer tasted one before I went, said it was spot on. But village whispers, Miss Marple recalled from her morning chats, spoke of tensions. Tom chafing at low wages, dreaming of his own shop. A motive, perhaps, if inheritance loomed. As Tom excused himself to tend the ovens, "Can't let the fire die out," the door opened to admit Mr. Reginald Croft, the rival, baker from the adjacent hamlet of Much Benham. A thin man with a sharp nose and a perpetual squint, as if forever appraising dough's rise, Croft carried a basket of his own condolences. Loaves wrapped in cloth. Mrs. Pettifer, he said stiffly, his voice laced with a competitive edge, a sad day. Harold and I had our differences, customers flocking to his tarts over mine, but he was a fair rival. Edith's lips tightened. Differences? You accused him of stealing your apple recipe last month, Reginald. Shouted it in the market for all to hear. Croft flushed, setting his basket down with a thud. Miss Marple observed the way his fingers drummed, a sign of nerves or calculation. Rivalry could fester into something darker, especially if business suffered. The gathering grew as Miss Lavinia Mead arrived, the chemist's assistant, a spinster in her 30s with a prim bun and a scent of lavender water that masked something sharper. She bore a tin of biscuits, her manner efficient, but her eyes darting. "Poor Harold," she said, perching on a stool. "I supplied his baking powders. Always prompt with payments, such a gentleman." But Miss Marple recalled the chemist's shop-stocked arsenic for pest control, and Lavinia's role in dispensing it. Had a quarrel over a faulty ingredient led to resentment? Completing the circle was old Mr. Giles Harrow, a cantankerous pensioner with a walking stick and a reputation for complaints, who hobbled in uninvited. "Heard the news," he grumbled, accepting tea with gnarled hands. "Pettifer's pastries gave me indigestion last week. Demanded a refund. I did. Stubborn man refused." His motive seemed petty, but grudges in small villages could swell like yeast. As the group conversed, Miss Marple steered the talk with subtle skill. "Baking is such an art," she remarked innocently. "One pinch too much of anything and it's ruined. Harold's apple turnovers were legendary. Did he share the recipe?" Reactions varied. Tom's pride, Edith's sorrow, Croft's scowl, Lavinia's evasion, Harrow's snort. She noted a faint white residue on Lavinia's sleeve, flour, or arsenic dust. Edith sighed. "He tasted everything himself. Said it was the baker's duty." That turnover, it was his last. Miss Marple's mind whirred. Access to the kitchen was key. The wife and apprentice daily, but visitors like Croft and Lavinia occasional, Harrow as a customer, slipping in unnoticed. As the sun dipped lower, casting amber hues through the window onto the flour-sprinkled table, Miss Marple rose. "You've all been so helpful," she said, her basket lighter. "In times like these, the village pulls together, like a well-kneaded loaf." But as she departed, the doubt's dough rose in her thoughts. Motives baked into everyday interactions, clues hidden in the crumbs of conversation. The scent of death was not just arsenic, It was the bitter tang of human frailty, and Miss Marple knew the recipe for truth required patience and a sharp eye. Chapter 3. Oh, whispers, over tea! The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in the tender glow of an autumn sun that gilded the meadows and sparked glints off the dew-soaked hedgerows. The village hummed with its usual rhythm, milk bottles clinking on doorsteps, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the distance, and the soft coo of pigeons nesting in the church tower. But beneath this pastoral melody ran a darker current. The death of Harold Pettifer, found poisoned in his own bakery, had stirred the community like a gust through dry leaves, scattering whispers of suspicion from cottage to cottage. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the breeze and her knitting bag slung over her arm, set out along the high street, her steps as deliberate as the stitches in her half-finished shawl. Her mission was not merely to gather news, but to listen to the words spoken and those left unsaid. For in the chatter of St. Mary Mead, truth often hid in plain sight, like a currant in a scone. Her first stop was the post office, a cramped shop where the air smelled of ink and sealing wax, and where Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, presided like a benevolent queen over her domain of stamps and parcels. A stout woman with a penchant for gossip as sharp as her letter opener, Mrs. Weatherby greeted Miss Marple with a conspiratorial gleam. "Oh, Miss Marple, such a to-do about poor Mr. Pettifer. Poisoned, they say, arsenic in his turnover. Dr. Haydock was here. Mentioned Harold bought a bottle of it from the chemist last week, for rats, mind you. Kept it in the bakery storeroom, so I heard." Miss Marple nodded, adjusting her spectacles as if to better focus on the tidbit. "How distressing," she said, her tone mild, but her mind cataloguing the detail. "Rats are such a nuisance in these old buildings. Did anyone else have need of such a purchase?" Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Well, now you mention it, Miss Lavinia Mead was behind the counter when he bought it. She handles all the chemist's poisons, careful as a cat, but who knows what hands it passed to?" The conversation drifted to the weather, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the arsenic, accessible to Lavinia, and by extension to anyone in the bakery's orbit. She thanked Mrs. Weatherby, purchased a postcard for her nephew, and continued her rounds, her sensible shoes tapping a rhythm as steady as her knitting needles. Her next destination was the village tea shop, a cosy nook with lace curtains and tables adorned with doilies, where the scent of freshly baked cakes mingled with the murmur of local voices. Settling by the window with a pot of Earl Grey, Miss Marple observed the patrons. Farmers in tweed caps, housewives with market baskets, and a gaggle of young girls giggling over biscuits. At a nearby table, two women, Mrs. Bantry from the Manor and Miss Hartnell, a spinster with a sharp tongue, were deep in discussion, their voices carrying just enough for Miss Marple's keen ears. "That young Tom Wilkins," Miss Hartnell said, stirring her tea with vigour. "I saw him arguing with Pettifer outside the bakery last week, demanding a raise, bold as brass. Said he'd leave if he didn't get it. Cheeky lad, thinking he could run that shop already." Mrs. Bantry nodded, her eyes wide. "And what about that stranger last month, complaining about bad bread? Claimed it made him ill, demanded his money back. Could he have slipped something in?" Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind racing. The stranger was a tantalizing thread, but too vague. a classic red herring, like the mysterious figures in her friend Mrs. McGillicuddy's tales. Tom's argument, however, was more concrete. Ambition could curdle into desperation, especially for a lad with dreams bigger than his wages. She made a mental note to probe further, her eyes catching the glint of a silver teaspoon on her saucer, oddly ornate, unlike the shop's usual tin. Borrowed, perhaps, from the bakery. As she paid her bill, the tea-shop door jingled, admitting Mr. Giles Harrow, the cantankerous pensioner, leaning heavily on his stick. His presence was no surprise. St. Mary Mead's gossip hubs drew all, especially in times of scandal. He hobbled to a table, muttering to the waitress about Pettifer's overpriced buns and his recent indigestion. Told him they were off, near poisoned me, he grumbled, loud enough for all to hear. Miss Marple's lips twitched. His complaint echoed his outburst at the bakery. But was it genuine, or a performance to deflect suspicion? Her final stop was the churchyard, where she paused to tend a rose bush by the lich gate, a pretext to overhear the sexton chatting with a farmhand. Heard Mrs. Pettifer was weary of the bakery life, the sexton said, clipping grass. Wanted Harold to sell up, move to the seaside. They had words over it, mark my words. The farmhand nodded. And that Croft fellow. His van was parked near the bakery last night, bold as you like. Miss Marple straightened, brushing dirt from her gloves. Edith's desire for change, Croft's proximity. These were ingredients in a recipe still forming. Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady click-clack as the afternoon light faded into a golden haze. The apple turnover, laced with arsenic, was the heart of the mystery. Harold's habit of tasting his bakes made it a perfect vehicle for poison. But who had the opportunity? Edith and Tom worked in the kitchen daily. Lavinia supplied ingredients. Croft had access as a visitor, and Harrow, as a customer, could have lingered unnoticed. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, where a grocer's assistant slipped belladonna into a rival's tea over a petty slight. The simplest acts, she murmured to herself, carry the deepest motives. The arsenic bottle was a clue, but its presence in the bakery was too obvious, perhaps a misdirection, like the stranger's complaint. The silver spoon in the tea shop nagged at her. It matched the one she'd seen in the bakery's kitchen, suggesting a connection, a careless borrowing, or something deliberate. As the church clock chimed 4, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the suspect's motives. Tom's ambition could have driven him to hasten his inheritance. Edith's wish to sell the bakery might have clashed with Harold's stubbornness. Croft's rivalry, stoked by lost customers, could have boiled over. Lavinia's access to poisons and her quiet demeanour hid what? Jealousy, perhaps, over a business slight. And Harrow's grumbling, while petty, might mask a deeper grudge. The meadows beyond her window glowed in the twilight, their serenity a stark contrast to the village's unease. Miss Marple's needles paused as she envisioned the bakery's back room. The turnover, its apples glistening, the acrid scent Dr. Haydock noted. Poison is intimate, she mused, chosen by one who knows the victim's habits. The whispers she'd gathered were like flour scattered on a counter, seemingly random, but ready to be shaped into something revealing. St. Mary Mead's heart still beat, but its pulse was quickened by secrets, and Miss Marple knew the next day's conversations would knead the dough of doubt into something closer to truth. Chapter 4. The apprentice's ambition. The sun dipped below the rolling meadows of St. Mary Mead, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet that softened the village's edges, as if nature itself sought to soothe the sting of tragedy. The bakery's shuttered windows cast long shadows across the high street, a silent testament to the loss of Harold Pettifer, whose poisoned apple turnover had turned the heart of village life into a stage for suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a constant companion, and her straw hat shielding her sharp eyes from the evening's glow, made her way to the modest lodgings of Tom Wilkins, the young apprentice. Her purpose was clear: to probe the ambitions of a lad whose dreams of owning the bakery might have curdled into something darker. The air was thick with the scent of late-blooming roses and the distant lowing of cattle, but beneath this pastoral calm, the whispers of St. Mary Mead pulsed with intrigue. Tom's lodgings were a small room above the blacksmith's forge, reached by a creaking wooden staircase that smelled of soot and linseed oil. The door opened to reveal a sparse space, a narrow bed, a table cluttered with baking manuals, and a single window overlooking the meadows, where the last light caught the tips of swaying grasses. Tom stood by the table, his lanky frame tense, his sandy hair falling into eyes that flickered with unease. He was polishing a bread knife, its blade glinting in the lamplight, and Miss Marple noted the care he took, pride, or perhaps a need to keep his hands occupied. "Good evening, Tom," she said, her voice as gentle as the breeze, settling onto a rickety chair he offered. "I thought to bring you some of my blackberry jam. Comfort in trying times. Poor Mr. Pettifer's passing has left us all at sea. You were so close to him, weren't you?" Tom set the knife down, his fingers lingering on its handle. "Aye, Miss Marple," he replied, his tone earnest but guarded. "He took me in when I had nothing, taught me how to knead dough, judge a crust. Said I'd run the bakery one day when he retired." His voice held a note of pride, but his eyes darted to a tin box tucked under a pile of papers. A savings hoard, perhaps, or something more telling. Miss Marple's needles emerged, clicking softly as she began a new row on her shawl, the rhythm a subtle invitation to candour. "A fine legacy," she said. "You must have spent many evenings perfecting those apple turnovers. Did you prepare them alone last night?" Her question was light, but her gaze caught the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his hand brushed the tin box as if to shield it. "I mixed the filling. Apples from the orchard up by Willow Farm," Tom said, his voice steady but his posture stiffening. Mr. Pettifer watched, gave his nod. "I left around 8. Had to fetch medicine for me mum. He was tasting one as I went, said it was the best yet." But Miss Marple recalled the postmistress's whisper of an argument over wages, Tom's voice raised in the market square. Ambition could be a heady spice, and impatience a dangerous one. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. Old Mr. Giles Harrow, the grumbling pensioner, hobbled in, his walking stick tapping like an accusation. His face, weathered as the meadow's ancient oaks, was set in a scowl. "Wilkins!" he barked, ignoring Miss Marple at first. "Your master's pastries were rubbish, made me ill last week. Poison, I said, and now look, Pettifer's dead of it. You've got his shop now, haven't you?" Convenient that his words were a blunt cudgel, and Tom's cheeks flushed crimson. "I'd never harm him," Tom snapped, his hands clenching. "You're just a sour old man, Harrow, always complaining about crumbs." The air crackled with their mutual disdain, and Miss Marple, ever the peacemaker, interjected softly, "Now, gentlemen, let's not add discord to sorrow. Mr. Harrow, surely you don't mean to accuse without cause?" Harrow muttered, leaning on his stick, but his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of stirring trouble. "Just saying what folks think," he grumbled, and shuffled out, leaving a tense silence. Miss Marple noted the encounter, a classic diversion like the stranger's complaint at the tea shop, but Harrow's venom hinted at more than indigestion. Could his petty grudge have baked a deeper malice? As Tom busied himself tidying papers, Miss Marple's gaze fell on the tin box, its lid slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of coins and a folded letter. "Saving for the future, Tom?" she asked, her tone conversational. He hesitated, then nodded. "Aye, for a shop of my own some day. Mr. Pettifer was teaching me, but he said I'd to wait my turn." The admission was reluctant, and Miss Marple sensed the weight of unfulfilled dreams, a motive, perhaps, if waiting grew unbearable. She rose, smoothing her skirt, her eyes lingering on a smudge of white powder on the table's edge. Flour, or something less innocent. "You've been most forthcoming, Tom," she said, her smile disarming. "Young ambition is a fine thing, but patience is the yeast that makes it rise true." As she descended the creaking stairs, the meadows now cloaked in twilight, her mind sifted the morning's gleanings. The arsenic bottle in the bakery's storeroom, accessible to Tom, was a glaring clue, but too obvious, perhaps a misdirection, like the stranger's tale. Harrow's accusation felt staged, a red herring to muddy the waters. The village was settling into evening, lamps glowing behind cottage windows like fireflies in the dusk. Miss Marple paused by the churchyard, where the scent of damp earth mingled with fading roses. A memory surfaced, a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, where a young clerk's haste for promotion led to tampering with a rival's tea. "Ambition," she murmured, "is like dough. Kneaded too hard, it toughens." Tom's tin box and defensive snap at Harrow suggested a lad under pressure, but was it enough to poison his mentor? Her thoughts turned to the other suspects. Edith Pettifer, weary of bakery life, might have seen Harold's death as freedom from debts. Reginald Croft's rivalry could have simmered into sabotage. His van spotted near the bakery a telling detail. Lavinia Mead's access to arsenic and her quiet demeanour hid what? Resentment over a slight? And Harrow's complaints, while trivial, could mask a deeper vendetta, perhaps over a past slight forgotten by all but him. As she reached her cottage, the meadows now a tapestry of shadows. Miss Marple spotted a glint in the grass, a silver spoon, identical to the one in the bakery and the tea shop. Borrowed carelessly or placed to confuse. She tucked it into her bag beside her knitting, her mind weaving new threads. The turnover's arsenic was no accident. It required intimate knowledge of Harold's habits, his nightly tasting, his love for apples. Tom's ambition was a potent ingredient, but the recipe for murder was still incomplete, its flavours hidden in the ordinary. A smudge, a spoon, a whispered quarrel. St. Mary Mead's heart beat on, but its secrets were rising, and Miss Marple knew the next day's conversations would knead the dough of doubt into something sharper, ready to cut through the village's gentle façade. Chapter 5. The Widow's Secret. The late afternoon draped St. Mary Mead in a golden veil. The meadows beyond the village, glowing with the soft warmth of an autumn sun sinking toward the horizon. The air carried the faint sweetness of ripe apples from nearby orchards, mingling with the earthy tang of turned soil. But the village's heart beat unevenly, stirred by the tragedy of Pettifer's pastries. The bakery remained shuttered, its once welcoming windows now reflecting the fading light like unseeing eyes. Miss Jane Marple, her sensible grey coat buttoned against the evening chill, and her knitting bag a faithful shadow, made her way back to the bakery's private quarters. Her basket held a fresh jar of her damson jam, a pretext for a visit to Mrs. Edith Pettifer, whose weary demeanour and practical hands hinted at burdens beyond widowhood. The whispers of St. Mary Mead, Tom's ambitions, Croft's rivalry, Lavinia's poisons, Harrow's grumbles swirled in Miss Marple's mind. But it was Edith's untold story that beckoned, like a hidden seam in a familiar quilt. The side door opened to reveal Edith in a flower-streaked apron, her broad face etched with exhaustion, yet softened by gratitude. "Miss Marple, you're too kind to call again," she said, ushering her into the kitchen. The room was a haven of warmth, despite its sorrow. The oak table gleamed under lamplight, copper pots hung silent, and a kettle hissed softly as if reluctant to disturb the grief. A faint scent of burnt sugar lingered, a ghostly echo of Harold's last bake. Miss Marple settled into a chair, noting a new detail. A small sewing basket tucked beneath the table, its lid ajar, revealing a tangle of threads and a folded letter half hidden among them. "Tea, Miss Marple," Edith offered, her hands steady as she poured from a chipped teapot. "It's been a day of questions, Constable Slack poking about, asking about Harold's habits. I told him all I know, but it's little enough." Her voice held a tremor, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the way her fingers lingered on the teapot's handle, as if anchoring herself to routine. "A trying time," Miss Marple replied, her tone as soothing as the steam rising from her cup. "Harold's bakery was the soul of St. Mary Mead. You must have shared so many evenings here, planning the next day's loaves. Did anything trouble him lately? Business, perhaps, or personal matters?" Her question was gentle, but her gaze was keen, noting the slight flinch in Edith's posture. Edith sighed, sinking into a chair opposite. He was tired, truth be told. The bakery's debts piled up, bad flour shipments last year, and customers like old Harrow never paying on time. Harold talked of selling, moving to the coast for a quieter life. "I wanted to stay. St. Mary Mead's my home. We had words over it, but nothing serious." Her eyes drifted to the sewing basket, and Miss Marple sensed a secret stirring, like dough rising under a cloth. As they sipped, the conversation turned to the fatal evening. "I helped with the accounts till 8, Edith said, then went upstairs with a headache. Harold stayed to finish the turnovers, always tasted them himself, to be sure. I heard him humming as I drifted off. When I came down at dawn—" Her voice broke, and she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, its edge embroidered with tiny violets, a touch of care in her practical world. Miss Marple's needles emerged, their rhythmic click a quiet invitation to candour. "Such a devoted husband," she murmured, "and yet running a bakery is such a shared endeavour." Did anyone else linger that night? Tom, perhaps, or a visitor? Her eyes flicked to the letter in the basket, its wax seal glinting faintly. Edith hesitated, her fingers twisting the handkerchief. "Tom left early, said he had errands. I saw no one else, though." "Well, Miss Lavinia Mead dropped by earlier, delivering baking soda. She was in the storeroom a moment, checking stock, she said." Her tone was neutral, but Miss Marple noted the pause, the glance toward the storeroom door, where the arsenic bottle had been kept. The door creaked open, admitting a gust of cool air, and the figure of Miss Lavinia Mead herself, her lavender-scented presence as crisp as her starched blouse. "Mrs. Pettifer, I brought some herbs. Thought they might cheer you," she said, setting a bundle on the table. Her eyes, sharp behind pince-nez glasses, darted to Miss Marple. "And Miss Marple, still comforting the village, I see." "Merely offering support," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "You were so kind to supply the bakery's needs." "Harold relied on your precision, didn't he?" Lavinia nodded, but her fingers brushed a faint white powder from her sleeve. A gesture Miss Marple had seen before, suggesting more than flour. "He was particular about his ingredients," Lavinia said. "I made sure every delivery was perfect." As Lavinia excused herself, citing a chemist's errand, Miss Marple's gaze returned to the sewing basket. "Such a charming hobby, Edith," she said lightly. "May I see your work?" Before Edith could protest, she lifted the lid, revealing the letter, a solicitor's note, its contents obscured but its seal broken. Edith flushed, snatching it back. "Just personal matters," she said quickly. "Harold was planning a surprise, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind alight. A surprise, or a motive? The letter hinted at financial or personal strains, perhaps a will or a debt settlement. The storeroom, where Lavinia had lingered, was another thread. The arsenic bottle, half empty, was too convenient a clue, suggesting a plant to mislead. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a wife's secret loan drove her to poison a creditor. "Secrets," she mused silently, "are like yeast, hidden, but they change everything." As the light faded, casting long shadows across the kitchen's flagstones, Miss Marple rose, her basket lighter, but her thoughts heavier. "You've been most kind, Edith," she said, patting her hand. "Grief is a heavy loaf to carry, but St. Mary Mead will share the burden." Outside, the meadows glowed under a crescent moon, their tranquillity a stark contrast to the village's unease. Her mind sifted the day's gleanings. Edith's reluctance, the solicitor's letter, Lavinia's presence near the poison. The whispers from the tea shop, Croft's van, Harrow's complaints, lingered, but a new detail nagged. A faint scratch on the storeroom doorframe, as if a key had missed its mark. Carelessness, or a sign of unauthorized entry. The silver spoon from the tea shop, matching the bakery's, suggested connections, a trail of borrowed items, or deliberate misdirection. As she walked home, the village settling into twilight, Miss Marple's needles resumed their click in her mind's eye. The turnover's arsenic required intimate knowledge. Harold's tasting ritual was no secret to those close. Edith's wish to stay, against Harold's dream of escape, hinted at deeper tensions. Lavinia's access to poisons and her fleeting visit raised questions. Tom's ambition, Croft's rivalry, Harrow's pettiness. Each was a crumb, but the recipe for murder demanded more. "The heart," she murmured, "is like a bakery, warm, but its secrets are baked in silence." The meadows whispered back, and Miss Marple knew tomorrow's inquiries would knead these doubts into sharper truths, revealing the bitter ingredient hidden in St. Mary Mead's gentle crust. Chapter 6. The Rival's Resentment. The evening draped St. Mary Mead in a velvet hush, the meadows beyond the village glowing faintly under a waxing moon that cast long shadows across the hedgerows. The air was cool, scented with the damp earth and late-blooming honeysuckle, but the tranquility of the rolling hills belied the undercurrent of unease that pulsed through the community. The bakery, once the warm heart of village life, stood silent, its darkened windows reflecting the moonlight like mournful eyes. Miss Jane Marple, her grey shawl drawn tight against the chill, and her knitting bag, a quiet companion, made her way to Much Benham, the neighbouring hamlet, to visit Mr. Reginald Croft, the rival baker whose sharp words and sharper ambitions had surfaced in the whispers surrounding Harold Pettifer's death. Her basket held a jar of her quince jelly, a pretext for a call, but her true aim was to probe the bitterness that simmered between competitors. For rivalry, like dough left too long, could sour into something deadly. Croft's Bakery, a squat stone building on Much Benham's main street, exuded an air of meticulous order. Its sign gleamed with fresh paint. Its windows displayed precise rows of buns and tarts, and the scent of cinnamon wafted invitingly. Yet there was a sterile quality to it, lacking the homely warmth of Pettifer's. Croft himself greeted Miss Marple at the door, his lean frame clad in a spotless apron, his hawkish nose and squinting eyes giving him the look of a man perpetually weighing his ingredients or his enemies. "Miss Marple, an unexpected pleasure," he said, his voice smooth but edged with wariness. "Come in, please." "I was just tidying up. Business doesn't stop, even for tragedy." The bakehouse was a study in efficiency. Polished counters, shelves lined with jars of spices labelled in neat script, and ovens that gleamed like polished armour. A small table by the window held a teapot and cups, and Miss Marple settled there, noting a bottle of rat poison, arsenic-based, the label read, prominently displayed on a shelf. "For vermin," Croft said, following her glance. "Old buildings, you know. Can't be too careful." His tone was casual, but his fingers drummed the table, a rhythm of unease that Miss Marple filed away. She accepted a cup of tea, its steam curling in the lamplight, and opened with gentle condolence. "Such a loss, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice soft as the meadow's breeze. Harold Pettifer's bakery was a treasure to St. Mary Mead. You must have known him well, being in the same trade. Did you ever share a cup like this, discussing recipes?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were sharp, catching the flicker of irritation in his squint. Croft leaned back, his apron rustling. "We were competitors, not chums," he said, his tone clipped. "Harold had the village in his pocket. Folks flocked to his tarts, said mine lacked heart. Accused me of copying his apple recipe last month. Pure nonsense, but it stung. I saw his van in Much Benham, you know, poaching my customers. Still poison? That's low, even for business." His words carried a rehearsed indignation, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand brushed the poison bottle's shelf, as if reassuring himself it was still there. The conversation drifted to the fatal night. "I was here, baking for the morning," Croft said. "Left around 10, locked up tight. My wife can vouch for me." But Miss Marple recalled the sexton's gossip. Croft's van spotted near St. Mary Mead's bakery at dusk, an odd detour for a man claiming to be home. "You must pass through our village often," she remarked, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her shawl. "The meadows are lovely by evening. Did you happen by that night?" Croft's squint tightened, his fingers pausing mid-drum. "Might have driven through. Deliveries, you know." "Didn't stop at Pettifer's, if that's what you're thinking." His defensiveness was a crack in his polished façade, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the arsenic bottle, so openly displayed, yet so easily accessible. A red herring, perhaps, to divert suspicion from a more calculated act. As they sipped, the door swung open, admitting Mrs. Bantry, a friend from St. Mary Mead, who had ventured to Much Benham for errands. Her round face lit, with surprise at seeing Miss Marple. "Why, Jane, fancy you here!" she exclaimed, then turned to Croft with less warmth. "I heard you and Harold had quite the row at the market, shouting about stolen recipes. Bad blood doesn't bake well, does it?" Her bluntness was characteristic, but Miss Marple noted Croft's flush, his hand gripping the teacup too tightly. "Gossip travels faster than my bread," Croft retorted, forcing a chuckle. "It was business, not murder." Harold's tarts were good, but mine hold their own. Mrs. Bantry huffed, unconvinced, and Miss Marple steered the talk to safer ground, mentioning the village fete. But her eyes lingered on a detail, a small key on Croft's keyring, its shape matching the bakery's back door. Could it fit Pettifer's lock too? As Mrs. Bantry chattered about fete plans, Miss Marple's gaze roamed the bakehouse, settling on a sack of apples in the corner. Their skins a deep, uneven red, unlike the crisp green ones from Willow Farm used by Pettifer. "Your apples look distinctive," she said lightly. "Local, are they?" Croft nodded, a touch too quickly. "From my cousin's orchard. Special variety. Keeps customers coming." But Miss Marple recalled Dr. Haydock's note. The turnover's bitter tang, perhaps from overripe fruit. A clue or mere coincidence? She rose, thanking Croft for his hospitality. "You've a fine set-up here," she said, her smile serene. "Competition sharpens the craft, doesn't it?" But it's the heart that makes a bakery home. As she stepped into the twilight, the meadows stretching like a dark sea, her mind sifted the encounter. Croft's rivalry was palpable, his alibi shaky, and the arsenic bottle too convenient. A misdirection, like the stranger's complaint that had faded into irrelevance. The key on his ring nagged at her. A baker's access to another's kitchen was a dangerous recipe. Walking back to St. Mary Mead, the moon casting silver light over the fields, Miss Marple reflected on a case from years past, where her grocer's envy led to tampered preserves. "Rivalry," she murmured, "is like spice, too much, and it spoils the dish." Croft's van, his apples, his defensive snap at Mrs. Bantry, these were ingredients, but the mixture was incomplete. Edith's hidden letter, Tom's savings, Lavinia's powders, Harrow's complaints. Each suspect added flavour to the mystery. The silver spoon, found in the grass, suggested a trail of carelessness or intent. Had Croft slipped into Pettifer's kitchen, knowing the baker's tasting habit? Or was another hand stirring the pot? The village lamps glowed as she reached her cottage, the meadows whispering secrets in the night breeze. Miss Marple's needles would rest tonight, but her mind spun on, weaving threads of resentment and opportunity. The death at the bakery was no accident. It was a carefully baked betrayal, its crumbs scattered in plain sight. Tomorrow, she resolved, would bring her closer to the heart of the recipe, where the bitter truth of St. Mary Mead's gentle façade waited to be tasted. Chapter 7. Bitter Bites. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle radiance, painting the meadows in soft pinks and golds that shimmered on the dew-kissed grasses. The village stirred slowly, its rhythm tempered by the lingering shadow of Harold Pettifer's death. the bakery's silence a wound in the community's heart. Miss Jane Marple, her white curls neatly pinned and her knitting bag tucked under her arm, stepped out into the crisp morning, her breath visible in the chill air. The rolling hills beyond the village seemed to whisper secrets, their contours softened by mist. But Miss Marple's mind was sharp, sifting through the crumbs of evidence gathered thus far. The arsenic bottle, the silver spoon, the solicitor's letter, the rival's key, and the faint white powder that might be more than flour. Today she resolved to revisit the bakery with Constable Slack, seeking the subtle traces that human hands and hearts leave behind. The truth, like a perfectly baked loaf, required patience to rise. The bakery's back door opened to a scene of quiet disarray. The kitchen's oak table still bore flowery imprints of yesterday's work. Copper pots hung idle, and the storeroom door stood ajar, revealing shelves of jars and sacks. Constable Slack, his notebook poised and his moustache bristling with earnest intent, followed Miss Marple as she moved with the deliberate grace of one accustomed to finding truth in the ordinary. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but respectful. "Dr. Haydock says the arsenic was in the apple turnover, mixed with the filling likely. But how'd it get there?" "That's the puzzle." Miss Marple nodded, her spectacles glinting as she surveyed the room. "Indeed, Constable." "The answer lies in the everyday, those who knew Harold's habit of tasting his bakes." Her eyes fell on the storeroom, where the arsenic bottle had been found, its label faded but clear. "Pest away, contains arsenic." She knelt, careful not to disturb the dust, and examined the shelf. The bottle was half empty, a detail Dr. Haydock had confirmed, but its cap was loose, as if hastily replaced. "Curious," she murmured, "that it's so prominently placed." Almost as if meant to be found, Slack scratched his head. "You think it's a plant, miss?" "To point us at young Tom or Mrs. Pettifer?" His tone was skeptical, but he followed as she moved to the workbench, where a scattering of crumbs caught her eye. Remnants of the fatal turnover, perhaps. She bent closer, her nose detecting a faint bitterness beneath the sweet apple scent. Discreetly, she touched a crumb to her fingertip, tasting the merest hint. It was sharp, not unlike the acrid note Dr. Haydock described. "The poison was in the filling," she said softly. "But these crumbs, they're from the pastry itself, aren't they? Why bitter?" Slack jotted a note, his brow furrowed. "Could be the apples, gone off maybe." But Miss Marple shook her head, her mind racing. The apples were key, but the bitterness suggested something more deliberate, a contamination not just in the filling, but perhaps in the dough. She stepped to the flour sacks, noting one with a torn seam, a faint white powder spilling onto the floor. "Constable, have this tested," she said. "It may not be flour alone." As they searched, a shadow crossed the doorway. Miss Lavinia Mead, her lavender-scented handkerchief clutched tightly, her face pale behind her pince-nez. "I heard you were here," she said, her voice clipped. "I only came to fetch my shawl. Left it yesterday when I brought herbs." Her eyes darted to the storeroom, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her hand. "You are often here, Miss Mead," she said gently. "Helping with supplies, no doubt. Did you ever handle the pest control?" Lavinia's lips tightened. "I sold Harold the arsenic, for rats, nothing more. I'm careful, Miss Marple, always was." But she hesitated, then blurted, "I admired Harold, you know." "More than I should. He was kind but he turned me away gently, said his heart was with Edith. The confession hung in the air, a fragile thread of motive, unrequited love, a wound that could fester into vengeance. Miss Marple's needles paused in her bag, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "The heart is a tender thing," she said, "and rejection stings. But you were here the night before, weren't you?" "Checking stock," Edith said. Lavinia nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Just for a moment. I left before supper," but her quick glance at the arsenic bottle betrayed a flicker of unease, and Miss Marple filed it away. As Lavinia departed, Slack pointed to a faint mark in the flour-dusted floor, a partial footprint, narrow and pointed, unlike Tom's heavy boots or Edith's sturdy shoes. "Could be anyone's," he muttered, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Or someone careful to leave the little trace," she replied. The mark was near the workbench, where the turnover had been prepared. A clue or another misdirection. Outside, the meadows stretched under a sky now tinged with clouds. Their serenity a stark contrast to the bakery's secrets. Miss Marple paused by the back gate, noticing a single apple core discarded in the grass, its flesh browned but oddly uneven, as if bitten and spat out. "Curious," she murmured, slipping it into her handkerchief. Had Harold tasted something off before the fatal bite? The orchard's apples, Tom had said, were from Willow Farm. Yet Croft's were different, redder, more bitter. A memory stirred, a case in St. Mary Mead, where a spurned suitor tampered with a rival's cider. Love and rivalry, she mused, are bitter spices. Back at her cottage, as the sun dipped low, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The day's discoveries wove a tighter pattern, the bitter crumb suggesting poison in the dough itself. Lavinia's confession, a motive born of heartache, the footprint, too vague to pin but hinting at caution, the apple core, a sign of hesitation or test. The arsenic bottle was too obvious, like the stranger's complaint, a red herring to distract from a subtler hand. Her thoughts turned to the suspects. Edith's hidden letter suggested financial strain, perhaps a desperate bid for freedom. Tom's savings tin hinted at impatience for the bakery's keys. Croft's van, his key, his bitter apples, rivalry could be a deadly leaven. Harrow's grumbling seemed petty, but old grudges could smoulder. Lavinia's unrequited love was a new thread, her access to poisons a dangerous tool. The silver spoon found in the meadows tied the bakery to the tea shop, carelessness or a deliberate trail. As the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Miss Marple's mind sifted the ingredients. The turnover's poison required intimacy, knowledge of Harold's tasting ritual, access to his kitchen. The everyday betrays, she murmured, her needles clicking. A crumb, a core, a confession. These are the flower of truth. The meadows outside her window whispered in the gathering dusk, and Miss Marple knew tomorrow's inquiries would knead these bitter bites into a clearer shape, revealing the hand that had baked death into St. Mary Mead's gentle warmth. Chapter 8. Narrowing the Loaf. The midday sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, its rays filtering through the ancient elms to dapple the cobblestones with light and shadow, as if the village itself were piecing together the puzzle of Harold Pettifer's death. The meadows beyond stretched in serene undulation, their grasses swaying gently under a sky of unblemished blue. But the tranquility was a façade, masking the unease that lingered like a faint whiff of burnt sugar. The bakery remained closed, its sign a silent sentinel, yet the village hummed with speculation, each whispered theory adding texture to the mystery. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat casting a soft shadow and her knitting bag a familiar weight, made her way to the church hall, where a charity tea was in full swing, a perfect stage for observing the players in this quiet drama. Her mind sifted the clues gathered thus far. The bitter crumb, the apple core, Lavinia's confession, the partial footprint, and the silver spoon that tied the bakery to the broader village. Today she aimed to knead these fragments into a clearer shape, narrowing the suspects who had baked death into a humble turnover. The church hall was a buzz of activity, its long tables draped in white linen and laden with teapots, scones, and jars of homemade jam. Villagers mingled, their chatter a blend of condolence and curiosity, the air thick with the scent of brewed tea and warm pastry. Miss Marple settled at a corner table, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the crowd. Housewives exchanging recipes, farmers discussing harvests, and children darting about with sticky fingers. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, sought the familiar figures of her suspects, each drawn to the gathering like moths to a lamp. Mrs. Edith Pettifer stood by the tea urn, her practical apron replaced by a sombre black dress, her face composed, but her hands betraying a nervous twist of her handkerchief. Young Tom Wilkins hovered near the refreshment table, his lanky frame awkward in a borrowed suit, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting judgment. Mr. Reginald Croft, the rival baker, lingered near the door, his sharp features softened by a forced smile as he offered a tray of his own buns. Miss Lavinia Mead, prim in a lavender blouse, poured tea with meticulous care, her pince-nez glinting in the sunlight streaming through the hall's arched windows. Old Mr. Giles Harrow sat grumbling in a corner, his walking stick tapping an impatient rhythm, his complaints about the tea's strength audible to all. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her needles a steady counterpoint to the hall's hum, and steered the conversation with her table-mates, Mrs. Bantry and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Thorne, to the bakery's tragedy. "Such a loss," she said, her voice gentle. "Harold's turnovers were a village treasure. I wonder, did he share his secrets with anyone?" Mrs. Bantry, ever eager for gossip, leaned in. Edith knew his recipes best, of course. She helped with the books and the baking, but I heard they quarrelled over selling the shop. She wanted to stay put, you know. Mrs. Thorne nodded, her eyes on Tom. That lad was ambitious, too much so, some say. My husband heard him at the market, demanding a bigger share. And those debts of Harold's, Edith mentioned them to the Ladies' Guild. Quite a burden. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind cataloguing. Edith's letter glimpsed in the sewing basket hinted at financial strain, perhaps a desperate motive to secure the bakery's future. As Tom approached with a plate of scones, Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. "You've a fine touch, Tom," she said. "Harold must have been proud. Did you ever experiment with his apple filling?" Tom flushed, setting the plate down. "Just followed his lead, miss." "Used Willow Farm apples, fresh as they come. That last batch was perfect," he said. But his fingers brushed a pocket, where Miss Marple glimpsed the outline of his savings tin. A dream deferred, or a spur to action. Croft joined them, his tray of buns a bold statement. "Trying to keep up with Pettifer's legacy, are we?" he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Mrs. Bantry, never one for tact, retorted, "Your buns are fine, Reginald, but Harold's had heart. That row over recipes didn't help your custom, did it?" Croft's smile tightened. Business, my apples, special stock from my cousin's orchard, draw a crowd." Miss Marple noted the emphasis, recalling the bitter core she'd found, so unlike Willow Farm's crisp fruit. Lavinia, passing with her teapot, overheard and chimed in, her voice clipped. "Harold's ingredients were always top-notch. I made sure of it. His suppliers trusted me." But her hand trembled slightly, and Miss Marple recalled her confession of unrequited love, a wound that could poison more than feelings. Had Lavinia's access to arsenic been her tool, or was it another distraction? Giles Harrow's voice cut through the chatter, his grumbling audible as he berated a waitress. "This tea's weak as Pettifer's pastries were off. Made me ill, I told him. Never listened." His complaints drew chuckles, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. His indigestion story felt rehearsed, a red herring to deflect scrutiny. Yet his presence at the bakery, always lingering, gave him opportunity. As the tea progressed, Miss Marple steered the talk to the fatal night. "Such a quiet evening," she mused, "yet someone slipped into that kitchen." The apples, were they always from Willow Farm? Tom nodded, but Croft interjected, "Mine are better, unique flavour." The distinction was a thread, and Miss Marple tugged it gently, recalling a new clue. A faint stain on the bakery's workbench, not flour but a sticky residue, perhaps apple juice, darker than expected. She excused herself to examine the hall's notice board, where a flyer for the village fete caught her eye. Pinned beside it was a receipt, Lavinia's from the chemist, for arsenic sold to Pettifer. Carelessly left or deliberately placed? Miss Marple tucked it into her bag, her mind weaving patterns. A memory surfaced, a case in St. Mary Mead where a jealous assistant tainted a rival's preserves. "Envy," she murmured, "is a bitter leaven." Back at her table, she observed the suspect's interactions. Edith's strained smile as she spoke to Tom, Croft's sharp glance at Lavinia, Harrow's pointed avoidance of them all. The stain, the receipt, the bitter core, these were crumbs of truth. The arsenic bottle was too obvious, like Harrow's complaints, but the apple's source was key. Croft's orchard, Lavinia's supplies, Tom's ambition, Edith's debts, each held motive, but opportunity narrowed the field. As the tea ended, the meadows outside glowed in the afternoon light, their serenity a contrast to the hall's undercurrents. Miss Marple gathered her things, her needle silent, but her thoughts alive. "The heart of a village," she said to Mrs. Bantry, "is like a loaf, whole until sliced open." The suspects dispersed, their secrets rising like dough. The stain suggested tampering beyond the filling. The receipt pointed to Lavinia. But Croft's apples and key loomed large. Truth, she mused, is in the texture, needed from the ordinary. Tomorrow she knew would bring the final ingredients, as St. Mary Mead's gentle façade crumbled under the weight of its hidden bitters. Chapter 9. The Needed Truth. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead hung heavy with impending rain, its clouds gathering like silent witnesses above the meadows, their rolling contours softened by twilight's embrace, The village, usually a tapestry of lamplight and cheerful chatter, was subdued, the weight of Harold Pettifer's death pressing upon every heart. The bakery's darkened windows stood as a sombre reminder, but within the Pettifers' private parlour, a different kind of light was about to shine. Miss Jane Marple, her grey shawl draped elegantly and her knitting bag resting by her side, had orchestrated this gathering with the precision of a baker measuring flour. She had invited the key players, Mrs. Edith Pettifer, Tom Wilkins, Reginald Croft, Lavinia Mead, and Giles Harrow, under the guise of discussing the bakery's future. In truth, she intended to unveil the murderer for the clues, the bitter crumb, the apple core, the silver spoon, the solicitor's letter, the chemist's receipt, and the sticky stain, had risen like dough into a pattern too clear to ignore. The parlour was a cosy enclave, its walls adorned with faded floral paper, a mahogany sideboard bearing a teapot and a vase of late roses. The lamplight cast a warm glow, softening the tension that crackled like static among the assembled. Edith sat by the hearth, her hands clasped tightly, her black dress a stark contrast to her pale face. Tom hovered near the window, his lanky frame tense, his eyes darting like a cornered hare. Croft stood by the door, his sharp features set in a mask of forced calm, his fingers twitching at his side. Lavinia perched on a velvet chair, her pince-nez glinting as she clutched a handkerchief, its lavender scent sharp in the close air. Harrow slumped in an armchair, his walking stick propped beside him, his grumbling muted, but his eyes keen. Constable Slack lingered by the door, his notebook ready, while Mrs. Bantry, invited for moral support, sat quietly, her curiosity palpable. Miss Marple rose, her slight figure commanding the room with a quiet authority that belied her years. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice as gentle as the meadow's breeze, yet edged with steel. "Harold Pettifer's death has left a void in St. Mary Mead, and it is time we filled it with truth. The murderer, I believe, is among us." A collective gasp rippled through the parlour. Croft's hand stilled, his squint narrowing. "That's a bold claim, Miss Marple," he said, his tone icy. "You've proof, I hope." Edith's eyes widened. Tom shifted uneasily. Lavinia's handkerchief trembled, and Harrow snorted, "Poppycock!" Miss Marple's smile was serene, her needles idle in her lap. "Proof is in the pattern," she said, pacing slowly, her eyes sweeping the room. "Harold died of arsenic slipped into his apple turnover, a treat he tasted nightly. The poison was in the filling, Dr. Haydock confirmed, but a bitter crumb suggested more. The dough itself was tainted. This was no accident, but a calculated act, requiring knowledge of his habits and access to his kitchen." She paused, letting the weight settle. "The arsenic bottle in the storeroom was too obvious, a misdirection, like the stranger's complaint that proved baseless. Let us consider the suspects." Her gaze fell on Edith. "Mrs. Pettifer, you longed to stay in St. Mary Mead, while Harold dreamed of selling. A letter from a solicitor, hidden in your sewing basket, spoke of debts, perhaps a motive to secure the bakery's future." Edith gasped, her hands twisting. "I loved Harold." "The letter was about his will. He meant to surprise me with a nest egg." Her voice rang true, and Miss Marple nodded, turning to Tom. "Young Tom, your ambition burned bright. A savings tin, arguments over wages. Did you hasten your inheritance?" Tom's face reddened. "I'd never harm him." "That tin was for my future. Marriage, not murder." His earnestness was convincing, but Miss Marple pressed on. "Mr. Croft," she said, facing the rival baker, "your feud with Harold was fierce. Lost customers, stolen recipes. Your van was seen near the bakery that night. Your key could fit its lock, and your apples, bitter, unlike Willow Farms, matched the core I found." Croft's squint hardened. "Business rivalry, not murder. I was home by 10. My wife swears it." Miss Marple's eyes moved to Lavinia. "Miss Mead, your unrequited love for Harold, your access to arsenic, rejection can wound deeply." "You were in the storeroom that evening." Lavinia's face paled. "I only delivered supplies." "I'd never." Her voice broke, but her eyes held fear. "Finally, Harrow." "Mr. Harrow, your complaints masked opportunity. Your indigestion. Was it a ruse to deflect suspicion?" Harrow banged his stick. "Nonsense! I'm no poisoner, just a man who likes decent bread." Miss Marple's voice softened, but her resolve was iron. "The truth lies in the details." A sticky stain on the workbench. Apple juice, darker than Willow Farm's fruit. A receipt from the chemist, left carelessly, showing Lavinia sold the arsenic. A silver spoon, found in the meadows, linking the bakery to the tea shop. And the bitter crumb, not just the filling, but the dough, tainted with arsenic. She turned to Croft, her gaze piercing. "Mr. Croft, you slipped into the bakery that evening, using a key you'd acquired, perhaps from a delivery. You brought apples from your cousin's orchard, overripe and bitter, knowing Harold would taste the turnover. You mixed arsenic into the dough, not the filling, to ensure it was undetectable until too late. The core I found, spat out perhaps when Harold sensed the bitterness, was yours. Your rivalry, not just for customers but for pride, drove you to murder Croft's face drained of colour, his hands clenching. "You've no proof!" he shouted, but his voice cracked. The room held its breath as Slack stepped forward, his notebook snapping shut. "We'll test those apples, sir," he said grimly. "And that key," Croft sank back, his defiance crumbling. "He stole my trade," he muttered. "His tarts, his charm, everyone chose him. I only meant to scare him, make him ill, but the dose was too much." His confession hung like a storm cloud, and Slack moved to escort him out, the parlour silent save for Edith's stifled sob. Miss Marple sighed, her eyes soft with understanding. "Human nature," she said, "is like dough, malleable, but easily spoiled by envy." As the others dispersed, Tom supporting Edith, Lavinia weeping quietly, and Harrow muttering apologies, the rain began to fall outside, pattering against the windows like a requiem for St. Mary Mead's lost peace. The meadows beyond glowed faintly under the moon, their secrets laid bare. Miss Marple gathered her bag, her needles still. "The truth rises," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, who looked awestruck. "Like a loaf, it needs only time and care." The parlour emptied, leaving the scent of roses and the echo of betrayal. But Miss Marple knew the final chapter awaited, over tea, where the village would mend its heart under her gentle guidance. Chapter 10. Tea and Tidings. The morning sun spilled over the rolling meadows of St. Mary Mead, its golden rays weaving through the mist to touch the thatched roofs and ancient hedgerows with a promise of renewal. The village, though still tender from the shock of Harold Pettifer's death, stirred with a quiet resilience. The milk cart rattled along the cobblestones, the church bells chimed a gentle summons, and the scent of dew-kissed grass mingled with the faint perfume of late roses. At Miss Jane Marple's cottage, a haven of order with its climbing clematis and polished windows, the kitchen glowed with the warmth of a new day. The table was set with her best bone china, cups adorned with delicate forget-me-nots, and a plate of fresh scones, their golden crusts a nod to the bakery's legacy. A pot of Darjeeling steamed invitingly, and Miss Marple, her white curls immaculate and her knitting bag at her side, prepared to host a small gathering. Mrs. Edith Pettifer, Tom Wilkins, Miss Lavinia Mead, and Mrs. Bantry, to explain the unravelling of the mystery that had shaken their village. The air was soft with anticipation, like dough awaiting the oven's alchemy. Miss Marple, in a lavender cardigan that matched the morning's calm, poured tea with a steady hand, her sharp blue eyes softened by compassion. "Thank you for joining me," she said, her voice a soothing melody against the clink of china. "St. Mary Mead has weathered a storm, but truth, like a well-baked loaf, brings comfort when shared. Let us piece together poor Harold's tragedy." Edith, her black dress softened by a cream shawl, sat with a fragile dignity, her hands folded around her cup. Tom, his apprentice's apron replaced by a clean shirt, looked less burdened, his eyes hopeful, yet shadowed. Lavinia, her pince-nez polished to a gleam, sipped delicately, her lavender handkerchief tucked neatly in her sleeve. Mrs. Bantry, ever the enthusiastic observer, leaned forward, her curiosity as bright as the sunlight streaming through the window. The meadows outside stretched in serene expanse, a contrast to the parlour's quiet intensity. Miss Marple's needles rested in her lap, her gaze sweeping the group. "Harold Pettifer died of arsenic, slipped into his apple turnover, a treat he savoured nightly," she began, her tone measured. "The poison was in the dough, not just the filling, a subtle choice that required intimate knowledge of his habits. The bakery was his sanctuary, yet it became his undoing. Let us trace the crumbs that led to Mr. Reginald Croft." She sipped her tea, letting the silence deepen. The arsenic bottle in the storeroom was too obvious. A misdirection, like the stranger's complaint about bad bread, which proved baseless. The true clues were quieter. A bitter crumb from the pastry, a sticky stain of apple juice on the workbench, a discarded core in the grass, and a silver spoon linking the bakery to the tea shop. Edith's eyes glistened. "But why, Miss Marple? Why Harold?" Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "Envy, my dear, is a bitter leaven. Mr. Croft's rivalry with Harold was more than business, it was pride. His bakery in Much Benham struggled as villagers flocked to Pettifer's tarts. His apples from a cousin's orchard were overripe, bitter, unlike Willow Farm's crisp fruit. The core I found, spat out perhaps when Harold sensed the taste, matched Croft's stock." Tom leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I used Willow Farm apples, miss. I swear it. I'd never harm him. He was my future." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Tom. Your savings tin was for a wedding, not betrayal. The bitter crumb pointed elsewhere, to dough prepared when you were gone." Lavinia's cup clattered slightly. "I only supplied ingredients," she said, her voice tight. "My feelings for Harold were misguided, but I'd not stoop to poison." Miss Marple's smile was kind. "Your heart spoke true, Miss Mead." The chemist's receipt, left carelessly, was a distraction. Your access to arsenic was opportunity, not intent. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, interjected, "But Croft's van, Jane, seen near the bakery that night. And his key, how did you know?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "The meadows tell tales, Dolly. Croft's van was spotted at dusk, an odd detour. His key, glimpsed on his ring, matched the bakery's back door. A spare, perhaps, from a delivery exchange. He entered after hours, knowing Harold's tasting ritual. He mixed arsenic into the dough, using his bitter apples to mask the flavour, believing it would sicken, not kill, but the dose was too strong. She paused, spreading jam on a scone with deliberate care. The sticky stain on the workbench was his apple juice, darker than Willow Farms. The silver spoon found in the meadows was from his shop, carelessly dropped, linking his presence. The partial footprint, narrow and pointed, matched his polished shoes, not Tom's boots or Edith's sturdy ones. And the bitter crumb, tested by the chemist, confirmed arsenic in the pastry itself, a choice only a baker would make. Edith's shoulders relaxed, a tear escaping. I thought it might be me they'd blame. The debts are quarrels over selling. But Harold loved this village. Miss Marple nodded. Your letter was his gift, a plan to ease your burdens, not a motive. Croft's envy was the poison, baked into a rivalry he couldn't bear. Lavinia sighed, her handkerchief dabbing her eyes. I feel foolish, my silly hopes. But I'm glad it's over, Tom added. I'll keep the bakery going, miss, for Mr. Pettifer's sake. His resolve warmed the room, and Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. Jane, you're a marvel! Like a recipe, every ingredient in place. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft click. Human nature is the true recipe, she said. Like dough, it rises with care, but spoils with neglect. Croft's pride was his undoing, but St. Mary Mead will mend. She poured another round of tea, the steam curling like meadow mist. The bakery will thrive under Tom's hands, Edith's heart, and the village's love. As the guests departed, their steps lighter, the meadows outside glowed under a clearing sky. Miss Marple lingered with Mrs. Bantry, watching the sunlight dance on the grass. You saw it all, Jane, Mrs. Bantry said, awestruck. Every detail, like stitches in your knitting. Not all, Dolly, Miss Marple replied, tucking her needles away. But enough. The truth, like a scone, is simple but satisfying when shared. The village settled into its evening rhythm, the bakery's ovens soon to glow again. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind drifting to other puzzles. For St. Mary Mead, like her garden, would always bloom anew, its secrets merely weeds to be gently plucked. The meadows whispered their approval, and the mystery, like a well-baked loaf, was complete, crisp, warm, and whole, ready to nourish the village's heart once more.